Hey guys, I'm Apples and Dragons. This is Grey Sheep and Hedge Wizards, episode 13. Let's do this. A Storm of Swords by George R. R. Martin. The topic is going to be The Night of the Laughing Tree, continued. Part 4, I guess. He likes the stories where the knights fight monsters, cursing him for a frog eater. Yeah, that was where I left off. They snatched away his spear and knocked him to the ground, cursing him for a frog eater. So before I continue from there, I want to say some things about the whole story overall so far. Meera's Tourney of Harrenhal story. The biggest mystery in it so far is what exactly did the Cranog man learn on the Isle of Faces? What was the magic that he learned? And if you were to stop the story here, it would be obvious that that's the biggest mystery in it. And that would be the question that we're all asking right now, instead of who is the Knight of the Laughing Tree. So it's kind of interesting that the story has this big mystery in it that nobody's particularly interested in. It's sort of taking a back seat to the bigger set piece in it, which is the Mystery Knight and his appearance and his heroism and the three squires and the Starks. Because we're familiar with the Starks, they're like the main character family, and the Starks in this story are the parents and uncles and older relatives of the kids in the main family that we meet at the beginning of this story. So there's a familiarity there that gives us the impression that the Starks are the main characters in the story. And it's sort of carried over from the beginning of the Song of Ice and Fire story, because the Starks are obviously the main characters in that story. So I'm going to continue reading from Cursing Him for a Frog Eater. Were they Walders? It sounded like something little Walter Frey might have done. None offered a name, but he marked their faces well so he could revenge himself upon them later. They shoved him down every time he tried to rise, and kicked him when he curled up on the ground. But then they heard a roar. "That's my father's man you're kicking," howled the she-wolf. "A wolf on 4 legs or 2? 2, said Meera. The she-wolf laid into the squires with a tourney sword, scattering them all. The Cranog man was bruised and bloodied, so she took him back to her lair to clean his cuts and bind them up with linen. There he met her pack brothers, the wild wolf who led them, the quiet wolf beside him, and the pup who was the youngest of the 4. That evening there was to be a feast in Harrenhal, to mark the opening of the tourney, and the she-wolf insisted that the lad attend. He was of high birth, with as much a right to a place on the bench as any other man. She was not easy to refuse, this wolf maid, so he let the young pup find him garb suitable to a king's feast, and went up to the great castle. Under Heron's roof he ate and drank with the wolves, and many of their sworn swords besides, barrow-down men, and moose, and bears, and mermen. The dragon prince sang a song so sad, it made the wolf maid sniffle. But when her pup brother teased her for crying, she poured wine over his head. A black brother spoke, asking the knights to join the night's watch. The Storm Lord drank down the Knight of Skulls and Kisses in a wine-cup war. The Cranog man saw a maid with laughing purple eyes dance with a white sword, a red snake, and the Lord of Griffins, and lastly with the Quiet Wolf. But only after the Wild Wolf spoke to her on behalf of a brother too shy to leave his bench. Amidst all this merriment, the little Cranog man spied the 3 squires who'd attacked him. One served a pitchfork night, one a porcupine, while the last attended a knight with 2 towers on his surcoat, a sigil all Cranog men know well. The phrase, said Bran, the phrase of the crossing. Then, as now, she agreed. The wolf maid saw them too, and pointed them out to her brothers. I could find you a horse and some armor that might fit, the pup offered. The little Cranog man thanked him, but gave no answer. His heart was torn. Cranog men are smaller than most, but just as proud. The lad was no knight, no more than any of his people. We sit a boat more often than a horse, and our hands are made for oars, not lances. Much as he wished to have his vengeance, he feared he would only make a fool of himself and shame his people. The quiet wolf had offered the little Cranog man a place in his tent that night, but before he slept, he knelt on the lake shore, looking across the water to where the Isle of Faces would be, and said a prayer to the old gods of North and Neck. You never heard this tale from your father? Asked Jojen. It was old Nan who told the stories. Meera, go on. You can't stop there. Hodor must have felt the same. Hodor, he said, and then, Hodor, 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 Hodor. Well, said Meera, if you would hear the rest. Yes, tell it. 5 days of jousting were planned. All right, I'm going to stop there. That's a lot of text. I have a lot to say about it. Oh my god. Bran asks, were they Walders? Referring to the squires who beat up the Cranog men. Because Bran is familiar with the Walders, because as part of the agreement for passage to cross the bridge, for Robb's army to cross the bridge at the Twins, Catelyn agreed to take as ward two of Walder Frey's grandsons, Little Walder and Big Walder. And they're both kind of jerks, and Bran doesn't like them. And so that's why he says it sounds like something Little Walder Frey might have done. It says none offered a name, but he marked their faces well, so he could revenge himself upon them later. So the Cranog man is marking their faces well, so specifically so that he can revenge himself upon them later. And I want to draw attention to the fact that this introduces a new motivation for the Cranog man. Because until now, his motivation was to learn at the Isle of Faces, to study Old Gods magic or whatever. Study with the Green Men. And then he arrives at Harrenhal, which is just sort of a happy accident, and he gets beat up by the squires, and now his motivation is revenge against the squires. And this comes up 2 or 3 times in just this part that I've read here. It says, they shoved him down every time he tried to rise, and kicked him when he curled up on the ground. Earlier it said, they were none older than 15, yet even so they were bigger than him, all 3. So they're actually younger than the Cranog man. The Cranog man is, he's got to be 16 to 18, I think. Because that's the age of adulthood for them. So these 13 to 15-year-olds are beating up 17-year-old, let's say, is really only possible because the Cranog men are small and because there are 3 of them. If there were 1, he might have a chance. If there were 2, probably not. But 3 is just completely overboard. Like there's no shadow of a chance here. 1 versus 3. It's a completely unfair fight. They won't even let him get back up. He's like curled up on the ground, and every time he tries to get up, they kick him. That's my father's man you're kicking, howled the she-wolf. So enter the she-wolf, who, doing some character math, we know that that's Lyanna Stark. We can be certain that that's Lyanna Stark. Given the time period and the name she-wolf, there's no other girl it could have been. Unless the storyteller is lying to us with the wolf symbolism for her name. And so, one of the first layers of mystery that the story demands us to penetrate is to unveil all of the symbolic identities. And there's dozens of them throughout the whole story. Even the castle. Meera doesn't call it Harrenhal. She calls it the greatest castle in all the world, or something like that. And so Bran and the reader have to draw upon our knowledge of Westeros to single it down to Harrenhal. It's the greatest castle in all the world. It's beside a lake, and the lake has an island on it. It's like, okay, the only castle that could be is Harrenhal. So that's how we can be sure it's Harrenhal. And you can do the same thing with all the characters. The Great Lion of the Rock. That can only be Tywin, because the only place in Westeros called the Rock is Casterly Rock. And the sigil of the family that lives there is a lion. And a great lion might reasonably be the head of the house. And the head of the house at the time was Tywin Lannister. And some of the identities are more difficult than others. Like, I'm not even totally sure about some of them still. Like, the Knight of Skulls and Kisses. That's House Lawnmouth. And I think it's Richard Lawnmouth. But I'm only like 99% sure about that. And every single one of these characters has their own motivation, right? And so that's why this Tourney of Harrenhal story screams to me that this is my ultimate challenge. This is a Song of Ice and Fire's ultimate challenge. Because you have to run through this story, this event, Tourney at Harrenhal during the year of the false spring, looking at it through the eyes of as many of the characters in it as you possibly can, in order to extract every little nugget of information that you're going to need to solve the mysteries. And that's another thing that tells me that this Tourney at Harrenhal thing is A Song of Ice and Fire's ultimate challenge. Because it's so self-evidently full of mystery. And they're mysteries that are orbited by other mysteries in the story that don't self-evidently relate to these ones. But the Tourney at Harrenhal story suggests that there is some relationship between them. For example, the mystery of what happened between Rhaegar and Lyanna seems to have a relationship with the mystery of Jon Snow's parentage, even though Jon Snow's parentage is not a textually provided mystery within the Tourney at Harrenhal story. The reader puts those mysteries together himself, having brought the Jon Snow's parentage mystery with him from the beginning of the Game of Thrones, as he encounters this story in A Storm of Swords. So, it's really important to distinguish which mysteries are textual, are provided by the text, and which ones are metatextual, are happening in the relationship between the story and the reader's perception of it. Because the metatextual mysteries that we extract from the story could be wrong. And the textual mysteries that we find in the story have to be wrong. Almost have to be. The only exception is like, the answer was who the story told you it was the first time, and your mistake was discarding that answer too soon. And you actually see that in play, and in several of the Song of Ice and Fire's mysteries, like in the Girl in Grey mystery, where, spoilers for if you haven't seen my Girl in Grey series, but the first answer provided by the text for who the Girl in Grey is in Melisandre's vision of a girl riding a dying horse towards the wall is Arya Stark. And we discard it for a number of reasons. One is that there's a passage right before it that draws attention to the fact that a prophet can misread the visions by seeing what she wishes to see. And we can see from the political situation between Melisandre and Jon at the time that what Melisandre wants to see is some good news she can give to Jon. And what better news could she give to Jon than your sister's on her way? So that passage leads the reader to conclude that Melisandre's interpretation, Arya interpretation of her vision, is motivated and therefore done wrong and therefore wrong. But by taking that cue, we run afoul of another rule of stories and prophecies, that you have to preserve the original telling of the prophecy in its exact words. And Sister was part of that original telling. Anyway, that's why it's important to distinguish between textual mysteries and metatextual mysteries, and to try to keep track of which ones are being handed to you by the story and which ones you are extracting from the story, because your mind is putting pieces together that may or may not belong together. And if you approach the mystery with fresh eyes or from a different angle than the way you normally think about it, you gain access to new questions. And those questions might actually be more useful questions than the previous ones you were asking. And so that's why I go into so much depth and thought into the text and the exact words that are being used in it. Because what I'm digging for is more useful questions. Like the fact that there's a big mystery in the Night of the Laughing Tree story that nobody talks about regarding what exactly the Cranog man learned on the Isle of Faces and what that magic is and what powers it gives him is a huge deal. And you'll understand before I'm finished with it. I'm going to continue with the text I read now. So the Cranog man's motivation apparently is to revenge himself upon the squires who beat him up. The she-wolf's comment when she rescues him is interesting. She says, "That's my father's man you're kicking." Taken at face value, it's a heroic act. She's literally rescuing the Cranog man from being beaten up. And the line, "That's my father's man you're kicking," might give us some insight into what it is exactly that bothers her about the Cranog man being beaten up. I think it's safe to assume that she just doesn't like watching people get beaten up. It might be an impulse to just protect the weak. But the father's man part might suggest a different impulse. What could be driving the she-wolf, in part, if not in majority, is that the Cranog man is actually a vassal of her house, of House Stark. And so the Cranog man being attacked is like House Stark being attacked by extension. And maybe it's the attack to House Stark that offends her, more than the attack to the weak. Now that's a pretty ungenerous interpretation, but it's a viable one. So I don't want to discard it right away. I just wanted to point out that there's more than one way to interpret that line. And I also want to say that I think if the proximal attack to House Stark is part of her motivation, I think it's probably only part of it. It can't be the whole motivation. There's got to be at least some part, and probably a significant part, that doesn't like to see the weak beaten up, especially when he's outnumbered. And she would want to protect him regardless of who he is, or what his house is, or where their loyalties lie. So I think, at worst, her motivations as a whole would be a mixed bag. A combination of those two things. It says, "A wolf on 4 legs or 2? 2, said Meera. So this comment, "a wolf on 4 legs or 2, it's kind of cute because it shows Bran's awareness of the Westerosi tendency to refer to people as their animal heraldry and sort of take their heraldry a little too seriously. And it's a critique of Westerosi culture that you hear from Illyrio Mopatis when he's talking to Tyrion, and he offers to show Tyrion what a real lion is by throwing Tyrion in the cage with the lions in his menagerie. To which Tyrion declines, but it's funny. Meera says 2 legs, so we can be sure the wolf is a human and not a literal she-wolf like the one in the Riverlands that was terrorizing House Mooten. The she-wolf laid into the squires with Attorney's sword, scattering them all. Attorney's sword, I'm pretty sure, is a wooden sword. And she's laying into them and scattering them, which I think they deserve, because they're kicking the Cranog man while he's on the ground. The Cranog man was bruised and bloodied, so she took him back to her lair to clean his cuts and bind them up with linen. Her lair I take to mean the Stark encampment, and all the other Stark kids are there. The Wild Wolf is Brandon, the Quiet Wolf is Ned, the Pup is Benjen. He's youngest of the four. And this is where the story kind of blacks out. Because if this were a movie, this scene of all the kids meeting each other and talking for the first time and getting to know the Cranog man, this would be like one of the most heartwarming scenes in the whole movie. You wouldn't want to skip it, right? But in Meera's telling of this story, it just completely blacks out. Like, they go back to the wolf lair, and there's no mention of what they talked about or what they did or anything, except until the feast is about to start. And they start talking about the feast and trying to get him to go to it. I got to pause there because I got to go. But I'll pick this up when I get back. I'm back. With the magic of editing, we skipped 10 hours. That's my father's man you're kicking, howled the she-wolf. Youngest of the four. That evening there was to be a feast in Harrenhal to mark the opening of the tourney, and the she-wolf insisted that the lad attend. He was of high birth, with as much a right to a place on the bench as any other man. She was not easy to refuse, this wolf maid, so he let the young pup find him garb suitable to a king's feast, and went up to the great castle. The she-wolf insisting that the lad attend, and the she-wolf being not easy to refuse, both suggest that the Cranog man tried to refuse her. He didn't want to go to the feast at first, but she insisted that he go and convinced him by telling him that he has a right to a place on the bench as any other man. As much a right to a place on the bench as any other man. And so, looking at the situation from the eyes of the Cranog man, why do you think he might not have wanted to go to the feast? He just got beaten up by 3 squires for being an outsider to Westerosi culture. For being different. He probably doesn't want to go to the feast because he's afraid something similar might happen. Physical violence seems less likely to happen in a big gathering like that. But being treated like an outsider and feeling like you don't belong, or just having awkward social interactions, are all sufficient reasons why a person might not want to go to a feast. But the she-wolf is right, that he does have as much a right to the place on the bench as any other man. And if he wants to go, no one can really send him away. He's under the protection of and gains membership through House Reed's vassalship to House Stark. And House Stark are one of the great lords of Westeros, so they're seriously hot shit. Regarding status, reputation, and wealth, and all of that, the Starks are on par with all the other great houses. Tyrell, Martell, Baratheon, so on and so on. It says, she was not easy to refuse, this wolf maid, so he let the young pup find him garb suitable to a king's feast, and went up to the great castle. Which means the Cranog man didn't have garb suitable to a king's feast. He's wearing his Cranog man clothes. And he's just coming back from a visit to an obscure island on the lake, where he spent an entire winter. And who knows how dirty that was. The young pup finds him garb suitable to a king's feast. And so, put yourself in the shoes of the young pup. You're Benjen Stark, and you're a little kid. You're the youngest sibling of Lyanna Stark, Brandon Stark, and Ned Stark. Not in that order. I messed up the order, but what do younger siblings generally want regarding their older siblings? Younger siblings want to tag along. They want to be included in whatever the older siblings are doing because they look up to their older siblings usually. And the older siblings seem like they're always doing really cool stuff that the younger sibling's not allowed to do yet, or doesn't know enough about. And so I tag on along, experience new things and learn new things, and run with the cool kids. And so if I had to guess at the young pup's motivation, it would be that he just wants to help out with whatever his older siblings want to do. Ned the Quiet Wolf and Brandon the Wild Wolf don't have any apparent motivation yet. But the She-Wolf does. Her motivation, we can say, at least provisionally, is that she wants to get the Cranog Man to come to the feast. The young pup has detected that that's what his older sister wants to do, and so he's offering to get clothes to help out towards that end. So the young pup is kind of making himself the helper or sidekick to the she-wolf, Lyanna. It says, under Heron's roof, he ate and drank with the wolves, and many of their sworn swords besides, Barrow-down men, and moose, and bears, and mermen. The bears are House Mormont, the mermen are House Manderley. I don't know who the moose men are. I'm sure somebody does, and they'll tell me in the comments. The dragon prince sang a song so sad it made the wolf maid sniffle. But when her pup brother teased her for crying, she poured wine over his head. That's probably like the funniest thing in the whole Tourney of Harrenhal story, is the she-wolf pouring wine over Benjen's head. Because she cried at a song that Rhaegar sung. Everybody's eating and drinking. A Night's Watch guy is looking for members. Robert Baratheon is having a drinking competition with Richard Lawnmouth. And the Cranog Man sees a maid with laughing purple eyes dance with a whole bunch of people. The maid with laughing purple eyes is Ashara Dane. She's really the only character who has laughing purple eyes, and her age at this time is somewhere between 12 and 21, which is kind of interesting that her age range is still so ambiguous. Like, that's a really big range. But I think there's a good reason for it. She dances with a white sword, a red snake, and the Lord of Griffins. So those are... I think the white sword might be Barristan, because Barristan expresses in a chapter in A Dance with Dragons that he was attracted to Ashara Dane. He was in love with her. But maybe it wasn't Barristan. It could have been one of the other King's Guards. The red snake is probably Oberyn Martell. The Lord of Griffins is John Connington, who is close friends with Rhaegar. It says, and lastly with the quiet wolf, but only after the wild wolf spoke to her on behalf of a brother too shy to leave his bench. So lastly, she dances with Ned. Ned Stark, at about 18 years old. But only after Brandon Stark, the wild wolf, spoke to Ashara on his behalf, because Ned was too shy to leave his bench. Which kind of fits with Ned's personality. He's a very reserved guy, and shyness is in the wheelhouse of reservedness. Amidst all this merriment, the little Cranog Man spied the 3 squires who'd attacked him. One served a pitchfork knight, one a porcupine, while the last attended a knight with 2 towers on his surcoat. A sigil all Cranog men know well. The phrase, said Bran, the phrase of the crossing. Then as now, she agreed. So the Cranog Man is the first one to spot the 3 squires who attacked him. And no wonder. He was probably like keeping an eye out for him the whole freaking time. Like, gosh, I hope I don't run into those 3 jerks again. But the Cranog Man's attitude is made really ambiguous throughout this whole story. After he finds Harrenhal. For example, the Cranog man needing to be convinced or persuaded to go to the feast suggests that he wanted to avoid conflict. But the Cranog man vowing to revenge himself upon the squires suggests that he wants to seek out conflict. So there's a subtle paradox in what we're supposedly supposed to believe is the Cranog man's attitude about the whole situation of going to the feast and the squires and all that. It's possible that the Cranog man is conflicted, so he's somewhere in the middle between wanting revenge and wanting to avoid conflict, and being conflicted about whether he should actually go through with his plans to get revenge, or even just go through with making a plan to get revenge. One of the squires served a pitchfork night, and the pitchfork night is House Hay. It's spelled Haigh. I think they farm hay, so it all kind of fits. The pitchfork, the name, and what they do. One squire serves a porcupine night. That's House Blount. And the last squire attended a night with 2 towers on his surcoat. That's House Frey. And their thing is that they make money charging a toll for passage to cross the massive bridge they built over the Trident. One of the rivers that comes out of the Trident. A sigil all Cranog men know well. The reason the Cranog men know the Frey sigil well is because the Frey castle is really close to the Cranogs. It's just south of it. So the Freys and the Reeds are kind of neighbors. Distant neighbors, but when you live in an isolated area like the Cranogs, distant neighbors is the only kind of neighbors you have. The Freys, said Bran, the Freys of the crossing. Then, as now, she agreed. Earlier in the story, when the Cranog man found Harrenhal, Meera was being a little secretive about what castle it actually was. He says, Harrenhal. It was Harrenhal. Meera smiled. Was it? So, she's not confirming either way regarding Harrenhal. But when it comes to House Frey, she just outright confirms it. Then as now, she agreed. I take that to mean that Meera has noticed that Bran is not going to be fooled by some of the easier to get monikers in this story that are disguising the characters and places. It says, the wolf maid saw them too, and pointed them out to her brothers. I could find you a horse, and some armor that might fit, the pup offered. The little Cranog man thanked him, but gave no answer. His heart was torn. Cranog men are smaller than most, but just as proud. The lad was no knight, no more than any of his people. We sit a boat more often than a horse, and our hands are made for oars, not lances. Much as he wished to have his vengeance, he feared he would only make a fool of himself and shame his people. The quiet wolf had offered the little Cranog man a place in his tent that night. But before he slept, he knelt on the lake shore, looking across the water to where the Isle of Faces would be, and said a prayer to the old gods of North and Neck. So at the feast, the Cranog man spies the 3 knights and their 3 squires. And then the wolf maid sees them too. And it's unclear whether the wolf maid saw them on her own, or if she saw the Cranog man see them, and then she saw them. Either way, she pointed them out to her brothers. Now you can imagine the Cranog man, if he still wants revenge against the squires, then he might appreciate the wolf maid pointing them out to her brothers and getting them involved. And because then the Cranog man can sort of enlist them in his project of getting revenge against them. Alternatively, if the Cranog man mostly wants to avoid further conflict, then the wolf maid pointing them out to her brothers is kind of a dick move on the part of the wolf maid. she's being inconsiderate and kind of instigating further conflict. And the wolf pup seems to notice what the wolf maid wants, and he offers to find the Cranog man horse and armor that might fit. The little Cranog man thanked him, but gave no answer. His heart was torn. Cranog men are smaller than most, but just as proud. The lad was no knight, no more than any of his people. We sit a boat more often than a horse, and our hands are made for oars, not lances. Much as he wished to have his vengeance, he feared he would only make a fool of himself and shame his people. So we get a very detailed and explicit description of the Cranog man's thinking and feeling. It literally says his heart is torn. So he is caught between wanting revenge and wanting to avoid further conflict. He may be small, but he's still proud. And he knows he can't joust. And that if he tries, he'll make a fool of himself and shame his people. This suggests that the Cranog man's plan for revenge was to joust in the tournament and beat the knights of the squires who attacked him. Which is a pretty brave plan for somebody who's never jousted before and hardly knows how to ride a horse. You got to give the Cranog man credit. He's bold. But he also knows what he doesn't know. And that's that he doesn't know how to joust. And more likely than not, he's just going to make a fool of himself. And embarrass himself even worse than he already has been. Then it says the quiet wolf had offered the little Cranog man a place in his tent that night. But before he slept, he knelt on the lake shore, looking across the water to where the Isle of Faces would be, and said a prayer to the old gods of North and Neck. Sometimes readers argue about whether or not it was possible for the quiet wolf to have overheard the Cranog man's prayer, because one theory about who the Knight of the Laughing Tree was that it was the quiet wolf, Ned, who overheard the Cranog man's prayer and then decided to fulfill it. The prayer presumably being that some champion would show up and joust on his behalf in order to get revenge against the knights of the squires who beat him up. But if that is the Cranog man's plan for revenge, it's a weird plan. I mean, think about it. It doesn't actually get revenge on the people who attacked him. It gets revenge on their knights. What do the squires care if the knights lose a joust and lose their armor and their horse? I guess their knights will be unhappy. Then they have to live with them as they journey back home or whatever. But it's a pretty feeble revenge, isn't it? I mean, as far as revenges go, the ass kicking this guy got was crazy. He was bruised and bloodied. And it was 3 versus 1. So even if he wasn't small, he didn't even have a chance. And so I want to point out 2 basic things about the Cranog man. There's a potential paradox in what we're led to believe is his motivation. He either wants to seek out conflict or he wants to avoid conflict. But you can't really want both and not be in a paradoxical state of mind. But it says that he is. His heart was torn. And at the same time, the plan for revenge that we're supposed to believe he has doesn't really make sense either. It's too indirect and too feeble, considering what happened to him. It said he was bruised and bloodied. So he got a serious ass kicking for no fucking reason. By people he's never met or wronged before. And by 3 of them all at once. The injustice is off the charts. The Cranog man should want to murder the squires in their sleep in their tents right now. But I'm supposed to believe that he's going to settle for this feeble revenge against the squires' knights by praying for a champion jouster to defeat their knights. It doesn't really add up, does it? You never heard this tale from your father? And I think that's where I'm going to stop today. as always, it was fun. I had a blast. I hope you got something out of it. And thanks for watching. I'll see you next time.